final presentation of the afternoon comes from Jemima, whose title is "Who is Challenging Children's and Young Adults Literature in UK Public Libraries and What Are the Reasons?" So again, I hope you agree, all the themes are starting to tie together a little bit. I think a lot about engagement, a lot about different kind of stakeholders, whether that's researchers or younger people. So I let Jemima share her screen and get her slides up for the final presentation. Perfect. I can see your slides. Can I hear you?
Hello, hi everyone.
Hello, hello. You're still there. Well done.
Thank you so much.
Over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to do this and having to follow all these wonderful talks. So here we go. So my talk is based on my dissertation, which the theme was "Who's Challenging Children's and Young Adult Literature in UK Public Libraries and What Are the Reasons?" Just an overview. Those were the main questions I was hoping to answer with this research. The aims were to identify common themes with any challenges, compare information found on US challenges, which was a big inspiration for my research project, investigate potential challenges and discover any reasons for them. The objectives were to investigate the levels of challenges in the UK and understand the library responses, the nature of the challenges, more detail, and the impact on UK library services. So a little bit about me. I currently work at the University of Lincoln Library as a library assistant. I completed my Masters in Information and Library Studies at Aberystwyth just this September, so it's been nice to see lots of fellow Aberystwyth students here. I've previously worked in bookselling, hospitality, customer service and retail before finding my way to libraries, and I studied illustration at the University of Derby. And my passions and interests have always been books, literature, art, and now I get to combine all of those working in libraries. A little bit about why I chose this topic. I've always been interested in sort of censorship, freedom of information. I don't know if any of you remember the show My So-Called Life. There was an episode called The Substitutes, which was about censorship of a small collection of poems by the students in the class. And that I was always so inspired by that story. It was so interesting. My dissertation was involved in Enid Blyton and how she looks at race, gender and class in her books. And she is an author that's come up again in this research. And some of my favourite modules of my Masters included studying freedom of information, research and censorship. So I've been able to carry on with this. I'm so sorry, it's ever so bright. I'll just try and turn my blind. So just an introduction. I've used the word challenge rather than censorship throughout the dissertation, but there is a little bit of a difference between them. Challenges are sort of accusations and objections to something. Censorship is sort of identifying and perhaps suppressing material that's objected to, be it obscene, blasphemous or political. This is something that did cause a bit of confusion in my research when I sent out my questionnaires. So if I do future research, I'll make sure to be very clear about what it is I'm asking about. But I was mainly looking for censorship challenges. And there have been global trends, which I found in my research. So there have been increasing challenges to library collections, rising far-right politics, increased AI use and extreme online content. There have been a lot of law changes, particularly to LGBTQ communities. And really the focus of study, libraries were asked if they'd experienced challenges and for details. I sent out 2,755 online surveys, so it was quite a big sample. They were given a couple of months to respond. I tried to exclude mobile school and local history libraries and just focus on public libraries just to keep it simple. And this has been quite an under-researched but timely issue. So my literature review, this was quite difficult. There isn't a huge amount of information on UK library challenges, which is positive because we have a really strong protection of our freedom of information in this country. But there was some recent research by Dancy Dansford Index on Censorship and CILIP as well, which was really helpful in getting an idea of how challenges are starting to escalate. I did visit some events as well. Alice Oseman celebrating 10 years of Nick and Charlie and her Heartstopper books did turn up in my research as well. So that was really, really useful. And a selected shorts talk hosted by Judy Bloom, which I had to sit up till midnight to watch live in America. So that was very exciting. And a couple of groups which came up in the literature review, which have come up in the research, Let Women Speak and Catholic Truth Society. Not many groups were named, but those two came up. And I did a sort of non-linear literature review. So when names came up in my research, I would go back and research those and then add that to my research as well. So the methodology I use surveys, but these included questionnaires and interviews. I used a reflective journal, the literature review as well, going backwards and forwards. It was mixed methods, so I used quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis, as well as thematic analysis. And this is just an example of my thematic map. The sample, I used an existing sample of the libraries that I mentioned. The surveys, I used open-ended and closed questions to get a mixture of research methods. The interviews were conducted by Zoom and email. And obviously I had to be very careful about my ethics with this project because I had to keep it very confidential. And so I haven't been able to go into as much detail as I'd have liked about where some of the responses came from, because I wouldn't want to reveal any of the libraries that were involved. So part of the methodology, when I was coding my responses, I started with grounded theory-based coding, which produced far too much data. So I changed to thematic analysis, and I've just added some examples here. But yeah, the thematic analysis was really helpful in just streamlining those responses and helping me find some clear themes. So I was very lucky. I had a lot of results, but generally, so I had 233 responses, so an 8% response rate, which isn't very big on paper, but it was a lot of data to get through. So I was very lucky to have so much data. Just a few of the examples of my questions. When asked if libraries had been asked to remove or withdraw materials, 29% said yes regarding their children's collection, and 14% said yes of their young adult collection, which again is quite a low percentage, but it is a substantial amount of libraries that were able to give me data. This is just an example of the frequency. So mostly libraries were able to say that they hadn't experienced these sorts of challenges, but when the positive answers were broken down, there was still sort of 53% of 53 libraries who did experience challenges, and how often. And in terms of how they were communicated to the library, 49% in person, which was surprising. I thought there would be more libraries, people would contact libraries through email or through social media, but it was actually face-to-face. And it did come through in the research that there's a very positive relationship between public libraries and their patrons, and even difficult interactions were resolved quite peacefully. So one of the main questions is, who is challenging libraries? So it's mainly parents, individuals and groups. Several libraries did mention exact groups who had challenged them, and I've just put some quotes here. So gender critical groups, far right groups, the group Let Women Speak, and a possible US-based organised group. So this wasn't named, but it just shows that influence coming over from abroad. And in terms of reasons for the challenges, most of the respondents were given reasons, and these are predominantly LGBTQ and sexuality in books. In terms of the other category, which scored very highly in the research, it's generally concerns about age appropriateness or occult themes, which is quite surprising, but it generally just seemed to be LGBTQ and sexual content. And so I did also ask about collection management policies. This is something that I studied in my master's and I found quite interesting. And it was mentioned by Eleanor earlier on in her talk about the consistency in staff following policies and how supportive that can be. So I did ask people if they had any policies in place to help them deal with challenges. And so it was a bit of a mixed review. Most of the respondents weren't sure or preferred not to say. And I think this is something that came across, perhaps, that there's a lack of confidence in library staff in knowing about things like policy. This could be because there's a lot less full-time staff who work in libraries now. It could be more volunteers. And yeah, that's something that could definitely be studied further. These are a few of the authors who came up predominantly in the research. For a variety of reasons, these books were challenged in the UK. Books like Sarah J. Maas's fantasy books, these were challenged due to her sort of adult content. Jamie Oliver was in the papers. He was challenged for sort of racial stereotypes in his work. J.K. Rowling, obviously she has been quite a popular figure in the papers for different reasons, but mostly hers were challenged for depictions of witchcraft. So there's a lot of interesting reasons. Series such as Asterix and Tintin, a lot of visual books were challenged, picture books and graphic novels, and some just for being what we would consider outdated now. And there's lots of examples of generally positive positive effects on service just by increased communication, even counter protests, so people protesting against these challenges that they've noticed, and some results were negative in terms of frequent challenges, but it depended on the library. But things came up in the research in terms of the effects. So policy references, intellectual freedom, the library's role as a censor. So this was something that came up a lot. Is it down to the library? Is it down to a parent to look at their children's reading? There was a mixture of compliance, non-compliance, and compromise. So whether a book would actually be removed from the library or whether it be put to one side and kept as a sort of a reference item. And there were a lot of what I call challenges to challenges. So these came up as things like communication, parental awareness, and then again, the staff experience, social media. A lot of the challenges were things like stock issues. So some libraries felt that if they had to weed stock, they would deal with the challenged books first and just take them out of circulation to make space, which is something that perhaps could be seen as not related to this research, but it does affect the results. And so I looked at the discussion in terms of the aims. So I compared and correlated the data to US challenges. The main difference is there's a lot of evidence of, say, US challenges in literature review. Challenges are more organised in the US. They tend to be really formally organised by groups. But in the UK, it was more just discussion with the librarian. There were a few protests, but it was mostly very polite customers bringing things to the attention of the librarian. And US librarians currently do face risk of prosecution. UK libraries, it's more a fear of job losses and community backlash. So I observed and identified common themes in the data. These included the LGBTQ, occult, racial and religious themes, and the common authors that I've mentioned, including some historical ones such as Enid Blyton and Roald Dahl, who continue to be controversial. Reasons for challenges, as I've said, mostly LGBTQ, trans content, age appropriateness. If there'd been a pride event, that would sometimes escalate activity in that local library. Often publishers request books to be removed due to ethnicity and sexuality. And then, as I've said, often it's a staff decision, which is quite interesting. And looking at the objectives, understanding the nature of the challenges, so groups, parents and publishers. But what really came through again is that strong community ethics, very respectful discourse between libraries and patrons, which is really, really nice to read about. In terms of detail, it was quite interesting to look at a map of where the challenges came from. London and South East England, I got a lot of responses, but that could just be because of the concentration of libraries in those areas. Whereas the further north you got, where there is less library provision, there were less responses. Challenges did tend to reflect local issues in politics. For example, there was a library in an area where there's been recorded knife crime. There was a complaint about knife crime in a book, and that was quite easy to see. So that was very interesting. And in terms of impact on library services, we all know there's been reduced money, resources and staff in all library environments, a fear of self-censorship by librarians. But again, a generally positive impression, even though there were these recorded examples, the stats were very, very positive. And so how libraries responded, as I said, a mixture of compliance, non-compliance and compromise. There isn't much classification of incidents. As I said, it's not as formal in the UK, so there are less recorded responses and ways to record them in libraries, which is something that could maybe be looked at if it becomes more of a serious issue. There was definitely a theme of trying to encourage parental responsibility as well, especially in public libraries. This came up a lot about having to have a conversation with a parent to explain that, you know, the library is not responsible for their children's reading. In terms of the level of public library challenges in the UK, a lot of the research is on school libraries, the current research, and this is looking at public libraries, but there's, again, a wide spectrum of issues. LGBTQ complaints was the second most popular reason. And this was shown in the literature review as well, the sort of sexuality content and parental complaints. In terms of the research that I've done, because in terms of its value, there was a high volume of data, so it does require further study. But it was my first research project, so there's a lot of lessons that I've learned from it. And limitations, really, the research design could definitely be worked on, as well as methods of distribution, because for many libraries, you have one email address to cover an entire libraries in one county. So the response I got back may not have been indicative of all the libraries in that area. Sometimes hundreds of libraries that I wasn't able to speak to directly. So there's definitely people I could concentrate my questions to and try and get more specific answers. So in conclusion, I provided evidence of UK library challenges, the reasons, those responsible and the trends. I was hoping to raise awareness and preparedness in case this does become a more serious issue. The main highlights really are that it's a very nuanced argument. There's a definite difference between concern for a child's reading and censorship of that item. The lack of financial support is very impactful in terms of how people make decisions about their collections. And then looking at librarians changing roles as we lose that support, you know, there is that lack of qualified librarians in posts. It's more volunteers, and the worldwide trends are affecting our collections. So, as I said, if I was to replicate this, I would make the research question much clearer, avoid duplicated questions. This was something that was brought up a couple of times, and I would make it a shorter time frame as well, so it would perhaps concentrate people's responses. And the results really can't be generalized because they're so qualitative, but they can be discussed. And even though it perhaps will be difficult to transfer it to a new study, there is a lot of data that can be discussed and researched further. So generally the lessons that I learned, it was my first big project, a very big sample. One of the biggest things that I learned when I did my interviews, I only did 3 interviews, but I did hand transcribe them from the audio. I had no idea that you could get technology to help you do this automatically. So that's something I would look at in the future. It would save me a lot of time. And it was an unfamiliar environment, public libraries, because I work in academic libraries. So if I was to research this further, I would maybe look at something I was a bit more familiar with, just to help make it a bit easier. And in the future, as I've said, I really want to raise awareness of this issue. It's something I find really interesting, and I think we just all need to be vigilant. You know, it's clearly something that is happening in our society. So I hope this has helped people maybe think about it a bit in their own libraries. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to welcome any questions.
Thanks, Jemima. That's really interesting, if not a little bit, as you say, worrying at the same time, given what your research has, probably alluded to, but maybe we think we're exempt sometimes within the UK, but the patterns, there's things are changing, things are coming, so to speak. So thank you for highlighting your research and also providing some top tips, because I know that there are other librarian students attending this afternoon. So it's nice to hear some practical things of what you might want to do differently if you had to do your dissertation again.
Yeah.
There's lots of questions in the chat, so I don't know if you just want to open it up and have a read through yourself. But the first one's from Paula around who responded to your survey. Have you spotted it, or do you need me to read it?
Let me, or maybe.
It's do you have an idea whether it was local staff, management staff, or chief librarians who responded to the survey?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, it wasn't always clear. I did ask people, but the only question that they had to answer was which library they came from. But they did sometimes say what their role was. They didn't always say, but a lot of the respondents did suggest for me to contact their stock departments, which I wasn't able to do because I could only send out one email. But definitely in future, I would try and focus my surveys to specific departments so that I could record that data.
And then the next one is, have you ever been challenged by someone in a library you've worked in about a book in your library stock?
So I've been lucky. I haven't really had too many challenges. I have sort of overheard my colleagues talking about different books and discussing whether or not they should be in the collection, which again is something that came up in my research, that often it is staff discussion and staff decisions on stock. But I have been fortunate not to have had any difficult conversations.
And then there's more questions. Is everyone still awake at this time on the afternoon? So you've got them well and truly engaged. So do you know whether any of the libraries had either specialist stock teams or staff? And if so, did this impact on the response to the challenges?
Yes, as I said, so I think often the person who responded wasn't perhaps in a position to know much about the stock department, but they did direct me to them in future. Sometimes the respondent was somebody more senior, and sometimes they would clearly say, no, I'm a volunteer, I don't make any decisions, or I'm not told about these challenges. So yeah, even though perhaps their response wasn't useful in terms of the research questions, it did give me some insight into that library structure and how I could direct my research next time.
And then there's further questions about managing dodgy books and having them but not getting rid of them just in case they come in useful for various reasons. The question around, did you ask if staff had challenged any books?
So no, actually, that isn't one of the questions. Even though I did ask about challenges, and sometimes they would talk about challenges within their own teams and when colleagues had made decisions about books, but I didn't ask anyone specifically. I didn't ask the question, was it you that made that choice? So that would be an interesting question to ask next time.
And I think I'll let you have a glance through. So I know Paula's after your contact details, so I'm guessing there's further follow-up things that she probably wants for YLG, I'm guessing. So I'll leave you to exchange your details with her. But thank you very much. It's really, really insightful.